few challenges and then look at some of the potential solutions that we've used for several customers. It's just a bit of an agenda we'll be going through. So some of the requirements that are new and I guess more important these days for different applications, being security and encryption, compliance, thinking about field device replacement. So it's pretty rare these days that people haven't gone through at least a process of deploying an application and then getting to a point for one reason or another where devices need to be replaced, whether that's failed devices or potentially just upgrading due to some of the technologies being changed. We'll talk very briefly on some of those technologies. I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We'll then go through a few of the solutions, looking at some concepts, and then talking specifically about solutions we've worked with several customers locally to implement. And I'll lean on Cade Miller a little bit there to talk about that, as he's been the key driver for us in gathering those customer requirements and helping put together those solutions. And we'll have a bit of extra Q&A time at the end. But as Adam suggested, or the other Adam suggested, you're more than welcome to ask questions during the presentation, and we'll do our best to address those as they come up. So the first discussion point here, really around increased security requirements. There's a very large number of factors coming into why there are increased security requirements. A big one being there's a lot more awareness of security problems these days. You probably can't go too far looking at news online before hearing about some sort of cybersecurity incident or attack, some sort of challenge faced by different business due to malware and many other factors, or external parties, if you will, gaining access to their systems. So as these systems in the OT environment are critical for the business to operate, there's an important aspect around, creating security around those assets to prevent stop of operation, loss of control of plant, loss of information potentially. But in this day and age, we are all a lot more aware that we need to worry about security. And there's also a lot more requirements coming, both internally as well as externally, on security. So this can come from governance requirements, corporate requirements. So if you are working in an OT environment, you might have an IT department, and they have their own requirements for access and control and security, which they push down onto you guys. So you have to have that same level of security or similar level of security as they have, or at least maybe implementing some of the processes they have, such as single sign-on, where the user authentication details used to access the devices in the OT environments are the same as those in the IT environments. That way, when a staff member, leaves the business, for instance, their access can be locked off at one point, and that affects the OT equipment as well as the IT equipment. Therefore, you don't have sort of lingering passwords. I'm sure we've all been in a situation where everyone's like, yeah, that machine down the back, the password's engineer. You just type that in, job's done. And there's a sticky note on the top that just says, password engineer. Those sort of security situations are not deemed acceptable these days. Certainly, with remote OT infrastructure, where you might have a piece of equipment that's in a place that's not physically monitored, having very generic passwords that anyone could walk in off the street and maybe access would be less than ideal. We also have with bigger network infrastructures going out into place, different requirements for security of the information that can flow across things. So it's becoming more normal these days for customers to say, hey, look, I know we have remote access to this site, and there's a PLC or a drive or something like that on the site there. We want to make sure that the only data that can pass through from the main system to the remote site is this specific information, such as the SCADA system talking to the PLC, and nothing else. So even if someone was to access the site, there's some control over the information flow there due to the security configurations that help to protect the system. And then on top of that, you have some security requirements around certifications. So security by certification or certificate files, which increases again the security for many aspects of the device. On top of that, logging, the list goes on. in terms of security features required these days. And if we look at, even just 5 or 10 years ago, the security requirements for a remote access device or a piece of OT equipment being accessed remotely were very small. It was kind of whatever someone told you they needed, or may not even been aware of what the things were that they needed. So they might just grab a modem and stick it out there and do a port forward, meaning that anyone with the right information could access that asset. It wouldn't be a very secure methodology. Um, so it's fair to say in this day and age we have increased security requirements, and those are many varied from multiple varied sources, and that's creating a situation where you need to be more concerned about not just what features you have, but even being sure that those features are enabled. How do you keep track of all that stuff, and how do you manage it all? The other problem that's been introduced is a requirement for encryption, which can lead to a different approach as well in terms of how you deploy and choose the assets and the assets that manage those assets. Um, so there's a big push for encryption. Most people don't have to be told because they've already been told. There's government mandates for critical infrastructure to use encrypted end-to-end solutions. Best practice from a lot of different security standards talk about using encryption. And, I'm pretty sure every IT department involved in any of these solutions is also talking to you about using encryption. So um, for those of you not aware, it's more or less, changing the data so that someone without the key cannot read the data. That means if someone was to intercept the traffic heading between two locations, they wouldn't be able to, get any useful information out of that. There's been some concerns that a lot of people rely too heavily on third parties in that regard. So if you have a WAN network system, for instance, and that's going through Telstra's network, what if Telstra gets compromised? Someone could then access all of that information flowing through that network. So even though it's a private network sold to you as a solution by Telstra or someone else, you know, there is a reliance that they don't get compromised, otherwise you're compromised. And so a large part of those solutions are simply creating an encrypted VPN tunnel between locations so that you can be sure that even in the event there is an issue on the other side, on the service provider, you wouldn't have your information compromised. Um, There's a few links actually we found that were quite useful when we're doing some research on some of the discussion points around encryption, which are at the end of the presentation. We'll share those with you as well, which do talk about some of the Australian Signal Directorate conversations around encryption as well. So what is best practice? What do they suggest you should be using, for instance? So not just talking about government mandates where they say, you must do this for critical infrastructure, but even where they talk about what Australian businesses should look at achieving. What are the recommendations for strategies? Talking about different policies and types of encryption. So we've got that information at the end. Okay. Compliance. It's a new challenge for a lot of businesses. We've had a lot of discussions with customers around this topic. So obviously the big one is government requirements, where they say, you must follow X or Y standards for different industries. Those apply, and they vary by industry. Also, there are some requirements coming out. We've had some discussion with the customers around device obsolescence or even firmware obsolescence. So, how do you ensure that the devices being used in the field are, up to date, running the same firmware, running the same configuration file? How do you know that they've got, X feature enabled so that they are in compliance with those standards? Um, and then you have, corporate requirements. So you may be in a corporation when they say, look, we've been following a really good standard. Maybe it's NERC or NIST or 62443, one of these sort of cybersecurity approaches. And your corporate requirements say you have to comply with that, and you've been told that as part of that you need to have, for instance, no insecure protocol, so no telnet, or HTTP only SSH and HTTPS. You then need to ensure that all the devices are running in that fashion. And that's a new requirement. So we have come across several customers where they have, used a variety of units in their OT environment, and those units would have different configurations because they were configured maybe 10 years ago and deployed, and nothing's gone wrong, so nobody's touched it. How do we know what the configuration of that unit is and whether it's in compliance with the requirements? And if those requirements change, how do you then deploy those changes into all those units? Similar or same requirement, I guess, on an insurance side. We have some customers with been looking at cybersecurity insurance, and those insurances will come with system requirements from the insurer saying, you must have X, Y, Z. You have to take, this, and we want to see that you've got log files and things are time synchronization. So if there is an incident and we ask you for information, then you can supply all that relevant information back to them for the claim. And the last one, which is always my favorite, is what about human error? So some sanity checks to make sure that whatever you are doing in the compliance, how do you know that you put it in correctly and everything's working right on all the devices? So once again, coming back to ensuring the configuration is correct. And in compliance with all of the compliance requirements, and also it's actually done on all the devices properly, which is another challenge in and of itself. So it's really about just once again ensuring that configuration is correct across those devices, because we've all done it. We've all made that mistake where we misspelled a word or something in a configuration file, and the device doesn't operate as intended. Another interesting one is field device replacement. So say we met all the previous requirements. We put in a robust solution that had the security requirements of, the governance body and the IT department, the corporate requirements, any other relevant industry requirements. All the configurations, all the right options were turned on. The device goes out into the field. 1 month later, something bad happens. The device fails. A new device has to go in, and now you have to ensure that all of those things that you did on the previous device are now done again on the new device. While it's possible, across an organization to have a handful of individuals with all the right expertise to get the first parts right, is that going to be the same team of people who replace a device in the field? And if it's not, how much time will it take for the guy in the field to actually replace the device and get it all correctly, and have someone check it maybe to ensure that it's right? Because once again, he could make mistakes. It's fair to say that over a long enough period of time, devices will fail, whether that's a fault of a device, maybe there's a fault of a power supply on site, maybe, there's an external environmental condition that causes a fault, anything from, rodents getting into the devices to, weather or corrosion. But, over a long enough period of time, it will happen that a device needs to be replaced. And the more complex these installations become, in terms of the requirements that you're meeting for this device, the more difficult it's going to be to replace as well. It's generally, the more complex it is, the more difficult it's going to be replaced. And if you make it easy by saying, yeah, just log in with this password and grab this file and put it in there, now you've created a new situation where that password and that file become new risk factors for your system. Who's got access to those and how many times have they been shared around? So there's a lot more information about your systems being shared out to people, which means a lot more risk to the overall business in terms of someone getting access to those devices or configurations with malicious intent, or who may do the wrong thing or even just make a mistake. So you'd have to, potentially spend time and effort training those individuals to be able to replace the devices, giving them key information to configure those devices about the systems. If those are contractors, that means handing out the keys to the kingdom to a third party, for instance, for your encryption. So it's, another issue that can come up from field device replacement, and potentially time. So for forever how long for however long the site is down while someone's trying to work out and get it up and make it compliant with your system, that's a period of time where that site is no longer accessible. And that can happen not just for device failure, but even just for something as simple as technological advance. So we have many of the customers we've been talking to have a requirement where realistically what they're trying to do is just move forward. So they have a system and it has been working for them. They have some new requirements. Maybe they've met and beat those challenges. But now they have a new challenge which they can't beat with their existing hardware, which is, okay, now I need to have, NBN compatibility on my device because the NBNs come in and, ADSL is no longer supported in this area, or, things like Cat M1 on the LTE network, or, 3G moving to 4G. There's been plenty of challenges that have forced us to move forward, change tact, or at least at the very simplest, even if we do everything the same, we had to replace that device. And so those same things we've been talking about in regards to how do you get the new configuration into the device, how do you make sure it's secure and compliant, everything set up properly, and that it has access correctly back into the rest of the network, and all of that is secure. That changeover process in itself can just be caused by technological advance, not by a device failure. So even if the device never fails, you never have a problem, at some point someone's going to say, hey, what you've been doing, that's great, but now you need to do something new. There's some new quantum magic modem. Who knows what tomorrow will bring in terms of technology, but there will be a requirement eventually for that device to change. And that's been, for us, a big driver has been there around that change. So people moving forward from previous technologies to new ones and needing to have that information sort of maintained as they move forward, or at least having a strategy to go forward, or putting probably a better way to say is putting in a strategy so that when this happens the next time, they are prepared. That's enough problems though, I think. I'm sure everyone has experienced one of these lovely problems along the way. Let's talk a little bit about some of the solutions, or a solution that we've been working with customers to get around some of these challenges. And those solutions have been driven around centralized management of devices and zero-touch deployment of devices. So largely, if you think about centralized management, it means that somewhere all the configurations for all the devices are being stored, and that is then helping you to ensure that the compliance of that device matches the requirements of your system. So if you get it right once, then that's going to be correct across the system. And that's a very powerful notion in terms of managing the system, because it means it makes it much easier for you to spend that time and energy, as we talked about before. You have a team of experts potentially, or even contracted experts, that made sure the system complies to all those things that are required. And once that's done once in a centralized management system, it's easy to introduce more assets and have those assets comply with that system. That's makes it much more easy for you to go forward in terms of how do you maintain those assets over a long period of time? How do you ensure those assets comply across many sites? And how do you assist your team in managing those assets who may not be the people with the expertise to make sure that those compliance features are met, for instance? And zero-touch deployment is on the other side, a discussion around, how do we replace an asset or get an asset up and going with the least amount of requirements at the actual installation point. So that is, I put a nice little simple flow there, basically grabbing a device and connecting it up, having it discover the centralized management server, having the management server provision that device, and then the device is ready to go. And so the benefits there are around, as we talked about, not handing out the keys to the kingdom. Nobody needs to know all the encryption keys and all the specifics around the configuration for your system and which compliance methodologies and options you've chosen to comply with. So the security features you've got, the passwords you're using, what you're in compliance with, none of that needs to be shared with these people who are deploying the devices. whether that's a contractor or your own internal people, they wouldn't necessarily need to know much at all about the overall system to provision a device. And so therefore that protects the business from too much information being shared with third parties, which just means that there may be nothing malicious on their part, but they may be compromised, and therefore your information may be shared with a third party from that third party. So really about creating a system that's safe in design. From a centralized management point of view, it's a bit of a drawing put together actually by Cade Miller around how the architecture can go together. So we would have a centralized management server. Let me see if I can get the laser pointer, such as this, which devices are talking to. So they make a secure connection to this centralized management server, and the centralized management server says, oh, yes, that's modem 123. Excellent. Here's the configuration file for modem 123. That would mean that the person in the field wouldn't need to worry about what the configuration is to have that device operate in the system. It also means, though, if someone comes along and says, oh, look, we just need you to change this one setting across all the devices because, now someone's decided this is a new compliance, or we have new instructions around compliance that needs to be deployed across the system. So you make the change in the config server, centralized, and it pushes it out into the field. And then you have an assurance that those devices and logs to prove that, of course, that those devices have called in, got their new configuration, and now they're running, whatever that change is that you require to be on the system. That could be firmware as well. So say someone lists, a new exploit has been found. This exploit is, XYZ. To fix the problem, the manufacturer's issued a firmware update. That firmware update needs to be applied to all the devices. You can then, deploy that over an entire fleet of devices without having to manually check that they're all done. You've got log files there to prove that they dialed in and they got the information and all the rest. So once again, helping you to ensure the overall system health and compliance. Is that gonna? Okay. So this helps us, create layers of security. So we have a separate connection with separate encryption for the configuration management, separate to any other layers of security that you've implemented in the overall system, whether those are VPNs, access control lists, all those sort of features. The devices themselves are also able to be identified by multiple sources. So we've done, and I think we might talk about this a bit later on, but we've had some customers who have, for instance, devices being identified by the service provider information, or IMSI. So that is, if a device is to fail in the field, we can exchange the SIM card with a new physical unit. When it connects back to the configuration server, it says, oh, okay, that's that SIM card. Yeah, here's the configuration file for you. So allowing for very quick field device replacement while maintaining all the security and compliance requirements across that system. This system I'm talking about is called the Guideros configuration server. It's a methodology of centralized management, which allows for zero-touch provisioning, configuration templates, all the things we've been talking about. It's effectively a tool that allows you to achieve a lot of the requirements across there. In terms of zero-touch deployment, as a concept, it's really a system that allows you to get those devices up and running, get them online with the minimal amount of requirements in the field. Zero touch, the idea being obviously they have to touch the device, they have to plug in the terminal block and power it up. The idea being they don't have to configure anything. So zero touch is more talking about the configuration aspect of the device going in and being installed, and then coming online and bringing up those OT assets for you. There's a variety of methodologies, as we talked about in the previous slide, for achieving this, whether it's based on serial number or the IMSI. This helps the system or configuration, centralized configuration tool to identify the device and get that online. So which configuration, which settings for the device is decided based on, serial number or IMSI, which is the service provider information. So it allows you to be a bit dynamic about how the devices are configured and put into the system. Obviously, the nice part is if that's for the deployment methodology, redeployment or replacing an existing device, it can be as simple as just moving a SIM card to a new piece of hardware, or moving the SIM card and identifying based on the new hardware a new configuration. So as time moves on, and there may be maybe it's migrating from cellular to NBN, for instance, or something similar, or vice versa, or maybe for a site they're adding a backup service with cellular to work with the existing NBN. You could just take that SIM card, move it to the new device, everything comes across, and it's quite simple. So the process for zero touch deployment, at least in the system I'm talking about, is to import some SIM cards. If you're doing SIM-based solutions, we can import a whole list of IMSIs into an asset database, give them a name and a bunch of site-specific details. And when those devices dial in, with a minimal configuration, so their devices would be delivered with at least the information. When you connect, go and talk to this central management system. And once they have that information and they talk to the central management server, the server says, here's your information, and they're able to, be brought online with the system. So based on the discussion between the GRS or the field router and the centralized management system, they exchange that information, and the centralized management responds with a configuration file, which is put into the device. The device then can come online, create a VPN tunnel, for instance, and get the OT traffic online. And once that's done, there's a nice little animation. Skip that. They have a secure configuration. We have the option or opportunity to also not store the configuration persistently in the device. Because we have a centralized server and the device has a minimal config, every startup, it could just get its config again. The advantage of that would be that if someone was to take that OT asset offline, they would not have any important information. So none of the encryption or authentication keys will be stored long-term in the device, which means that no one could take the device offline, for instance, and get access to the system. So that was a long list of problems, and then presented some solutions in terms of centralized management and zero-touch provisioning. I have my colleague Kate Miller with me, who's been really instrumental in a lot of our success stories, and he's been involved in several projects, and I've asked him to sort of take the names off a little bit and just talk about the customer's challenges and what we did to solve them. We have a few wonderful slides he's prepared for us, and hopefully he's ready to have a little chat about.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Happy to have a chat. I think this slide's going to change over to a couple of use cases where we've deployed the technology with centralized management and such. And yeah, very good highlighting of some of the reasons why cybersecurity is such a hot topic right now. And I always begin a conversation with exactly that discussion, because it comes down to what we like to call a security triad, between confidentiality, integrity, availability, and what it is that we can do to maximize all three of those and mitigate the risk of a threat actor, is what some of us like to call affecting any of those three components of the triad. And in the diagram that you've got on the screen at the moment, we have a dual cellular application. So one of our routers has got two hot interfaces, so to speak. So it sits on two different networks. In the example, what you see there, you've got one on Telstra, one on Optus. Why would we do this from a say an integrity point of view? Well, obviously, integrity is all about whether the information is correct, how it will be managed. If everything's being managed centrally but accessible over both networks, then basically you're eliminating that aspect of, as you mentioned earlier, more people having access, more people being able to control configurations. Is the configuration correct or incorrect? Can someone modify a configuration or tamper with routing rules and get access to other parts of the network? So basically, the dual, like the fact that you've got two networks also has an impact because you've got twice the number of rules and whatnot. So centralizing that configuration does very largely affect the integrity of the configuration and the operation of the system. But yeah, here's really maximizing availability. So with redundant interfaces, two operations is better than one. So if failure on the Telstra side of the network, Optus might come in and take over the reins. But instead of what you would typically see in a like a dual SIM application, having two hot interfaces means that the on the left actually knows the health of the secondary path or secondary link before trying to switch over. So, for example, if the Telstra network went down, the router actually knows whether the Optus link is up. So rather than going down the cellular router switching SIMs, then testing the Optus network, and that in itself creating a potential failure point. Because if that secondary link's not there, then well, you're up the creek anyway. But at some point it'll need to switch back. So what would it do? A non-dual SIM router would power down. It would switch networks, look at Telstra again. If it's not back, then it would switch off again, come back to Optus, and you end up with this flapping interface situation. Whereas two hot interfaces means it knows the redundant pathway is either there or not there. The reason IPsec is in this diagram, and probably in every one of these diagrams that you'll see, is we can actually implement what we call dummy interfaces or loopback interfaces on either side of that tunnel, and basically from SCADA out to the end devices, it means that you have only one pathway. You don't need to overcomplicate routing. You have one tunnel that operates over two completely different networks, and it seamlessly switches between the two. Might have a few seconds in the failover time, but you've got full monitoring of that with the NMS and network management system. So that's a real key part of this solution. So well, I suppose in this side it says VMS, but that could be a SCADA system. It only has one address for, say, an RTU out in the edge, and that makes everyone's life easier. If you have to double tags because you've got different IP addresses, then that costs you more on SCADA. So that's the reason why it's implemented here. And of course, as Adam mentioned earlier, IPsec gives you that encryption over both networks. So it doesn't matter what happens between your router and your firewall, your network. All that data is confidential. And of course, that confidentiality leads to the integrity of data. If someone affects the confidentiality of it or the integrity, they go hand in hand. I think we'll go to the next slide. There's a couple of different ways to solve this problem. And again, this is another very typical application, whereby you might have an NBN connection on one side with a high priority connection. This particular customer did the same thing. Obviously, NBN in this case was their primary network, secondary being Optus. They use some more complicated routing protocols, BGP, GRE, and HRP, etc., to ensure that failover worked from one network to the next. But the basis of this and the cybersecurity behind the application are the same. I think we've got a third one here as well. Here we go. This is an interesting one. Well, I know water authorities are particularly prone to this sort of situation, whereby someone may need to go out to a site and maintain equipment at a site. Whether they need to just check their program running in an RTU whilst they're at site, or look at some other devices on that local network. However, in order to gain access to those devices, they would either need to get into a cabinet, plug in, and access them that way, or find an alternative method. Now, getting access, opening a cabinet and plugging in usually means they've got to be they've got to have they've got to be authorized to do it. They possibly need a license, or in water authorities, I know there's a lot of strict requirements about safety, and if one person opens a cabinet, or if they need to access a particular part of a site, then they may need to have 2 or 3 people attend that site for safety reasons. And what we've done in this case is we've activated a wireless access point, which is controlled centrally. That access point is enabled for that maintenance person, and that maintenance person is authorized by, again, a radius system, which is back at HQ, and that monitors, but also ensures the integrity of that that user. So they are authenticated and they do have authorization at site. So therefore, they can wirelessly get access to those RTUs and devices at the site without having to open up the cabinets, without having to have the specific licenses and whatnot. It might make it cheaper or easier for them to maintain those assets at that site. And again, with that central authentication, it's a lot easier to manage who gets access at what sites. I think there was the classic Marucci door case back a long time ago now, whereby someone who was an ex-employee of a water authority gained access over an open Wi-Fi access point, which just had a hard-coded username password on the access point, and they turned things on reverse. So not what you want to see at a water treatment plant or a sewage treatment plant. But that being said, everything comes back to having full control, and having fewer people who have that full control and access to this security information makes the whole system more secure. It does increase the availability, the integrity, and the confidentiality of that system. One thing I haven't addressed by those diagrams, and I'm sorry if I'm just going a little bit over what you're expecting there, Adam.
That's all right, mate.
If with a lot of these systems, if you are bringing everything back to a centralized firewall, these days a lot of companies are also implementing intrusion detection systems that they're there to discover hardware, assess the risk, limit access, and of course restrict that access to mitigate the risk of cyber attack. Now, centralizing all of that data and bringing it through a central firewall in sort of a star topology does allow them to tap off that firewall and bring that information into an intrusion detection system. So they could manage and monitor the entire network from a central point, even if they've got maybe 100 or 1,000 routers in the field. So that's something else that's another benefit of having a centralized firewall and using IPsec and whatnot. So that's something else I'd like to add.
Fantastic, mate.
Sorry, I could keep going on for hours. I know everyone hasn't got that time though.
The last slide I had here was really what we talked about earlier, which is just a link to a few of the kind of helpful bits of information we come across while doing a bit of the research with some of the applications we've worked on. So we'll share that information around when we share the recording for the session, just so everyone has access to it. Yeah, that's correct. That's what happened at Worcestershire, yeah.
Oh, there I am speaking out of place.
Oh, Adam, you're muted.
I've had to disable your camera there, Cade, for a minute, so apologies for that. We just had a bad connection, but
we can blame NBN.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, guys. If there are any more questions, please chuck them in the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask the question. I think it's quite a broad topic, so if you are interested in more having further conversations regarding how we can maybe provide this solution to yourselves, or even just have a discussion about if it's appropriate for you, an application that you have, please reach out to Cade or Adam or myself. We're all available and can have that conversation with you. We've got a few examples up our sleeves, so if there's any questions, please jump in now.
What's the expression? Speak now or forever hold your peace? Yep. Or speak now or send an email later. It's probably more relevant.
Okay. Well, I don't think there is any questions coming in. Oh, there we go. We got one. What about IP WAN solutions for IoT devices? What solutions do you typically see across different utilities? Would you deploy LP WAN solutions in a similar way or continue using public LP WAN solutions? LoRa, etc. Kay, that might be a question for you.
Okay, yeah, there's plenty of discussion to be had about LP WAN solutions, Adrian. So if you're looking to deploy your own network, that's when, say, a LoRa might come into consideration. And again, there's obviously a cost to manage and maintain that solution. But in some cases, people like that privacy of having their own control and their own network. If you're looking for, very, very low power, now there's plenty of NB-IoT and of course Sigfox solutions. As you know, as some of you may know, I did spend some time working with Sigfox for a couple of years, and I've seen some amazing solutions for very low powered IoT devices. But it all comes down to what coverage do you have for LP-WAN currently. It's very difficult for anyone in this country to provide a nationwide type coverage for these very largely distributed networks. But again, it's a very broad topic, Adrian. And in terms of security, I'll be doing another presentation in a few weeks' time, targeted towards this type of question within the water industry. So I'll pass the details on to you if you'd like. It's a very long answer.
Yeah, no problem, Adrian. We'll definitely let you know when that's coming up. Even if it's more pressing, you can have a conversation offline as well with Cade. I'm sure I'd be more than happy to. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be doing a lot more of these moving forward. We have another question. We use our own network as the telecom providers and not reliable and are too slow in service on breakdown. Yeah. So look, that's definitely a common issue that we've seen, that it's much easier to rely on your own network. You have a lot more control over it. And if you've got the ability to do that, then absolutely. Excellent. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Kate.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you, everyone.